the nation that refused to die. Every single empire that ever tried to erase Iran made the exact same catastrophic mistake. They marched in with their giant armies, their shining swords, their arrogant confidence, absolutely certain that this time, this civilization would finally be finished. The Greeks thought so, the Arabs thought so, the Mongols thought so. And every single one of them, every last one, was wrong. One by one they came, and one by one Iran swallowed them whole. Not with swords, not with walls, but with something far more powerful and far more terrifying than any weapon ever forged: culture. This is not just the story of a country. This is the story of a civilization so ancient, so deeply rooted, so utterly unbreakable, that it did not need to win wars to survive them. This is the story of the nation that looked eternity straight in the eye and refused to blink. Okay, let us start with something that genuinely makes me angry. Because if you went to school in the Western world, and most of us did, your history textbooks told you that civilization began in Mesopotamia. The Sumerians, the Babylonians, maybe ancient Egypt. That is where everything started, right? That is what they taught us. And you know what? Those textbooks quietly, conveniently, deliberately left out what was happening just over the mountains to the east at exactly the same time. On the vast Iranian plateau, a rugged, breathtaking landscape of towering mountain peaks, scorching deserts, and hidden green valleys, human beings were not simply surviving, they were building. Archaeological discoveries have uncovered settlements on Iranian soil stretching back 7,000 years. 7,000 years. Pottery, tools, organized communities that traded and governed themselves and developed their own distinct understanding of the world. Iran was not on the edges of civilization. It was one of its beating, living, pulsing hearts. And the fact that most people do not know this is one of the great failures of how history has been told. The first great power to rise from this land was a state called Elam. And around 2300 BC, the Elamites did something that honestly makes me laugh when I think about how casual it sounds. They just signed the first international peace treaty in human history, like it was nothing. Like they just sat down one afternoon and said, you know what, let us invent diplomacy today. Before Rome, before Greece, before anything the Western world normally takes credit for, Iran was already sitting at the negotiating table, writing the rule book for how nations talk to each other. The Aryans arrive. Between the 20th and 15th centuries before Christ, something happened that would permanently change the story of this land. From the vast steppes of Central Asia, waves of nomadic tribes descended southward onto the Iranian plateau. They were Indo-European peoples, distant relatives of the ancestors of the Greeks, the Romans, the Germanic tribes, and eventually every European people, including the ones who would later try to colonize and control the very land these tribes were now making their home. They called themselves Aryans, meaning the noble ones, and they named their new homeland the Cradle of the Aryans. Over thousands of years, that ancient name slowly compressed and evolved and transformed into the single word the entire world knows today: Iran. The name of one of the oldest continuous civilizations on Earth is also the oldest name its people ever gave themselves. Think about how extraordinary that is. The name survived everything, every conquest, every catastrophe, every attempt to replace it. These tribes mixed with the ancient Elamite people already living there, blended cultures, merged bloodlines, and eventually split into two major groups: the Medes in the northwest and the Persians in the south. They were neighbors, they were relatives, and like all relatives throughout human history, They spent centuries arguing with each other before finally deciding to team up and take over the world. Classic family behavior, honestly. The god of light and the birth of history. Before the Persians and the Medes united, something else was born on the Iranian plateau. Something invisible. Something that would ultimately prove more powerful than any army, any emperor, or any empire that ever existed. An idea. In the harsh mountains and wind-swept deserts of ancient Iran, a prophet named Zarathustra began teaching a vision of the universe that had never existed before in human thought. The world he described was not random. It was not governed by dozens of unpredictable gods playing games with human lives. The universe Zarathustra revealed was a cosmic battlefield between two absolute and eternal forces. Ahura Mazda, the supreme god of light, truth, wisdom, and order, and Angra Mainyu, the spirit of absolute darkness, deception, destruction, and chaos. And every single human being alive was not a passive bystander in this war. Every single one of us was a soldier. Every honest word you spoke was a blow for the light. Every act of cruelty was a victory for the dark. This religion, Zoroastrianism, did something that no belief system before it had ever dared to attempt. It looked at time itself and said, "Time is not a circle. Time is a line. The universe had a beginning. It will have an end. There will be a final battle between good and evil, a last judgment, a purification of all existence, and then a new and perfect world." You know where those ideas went? When Cyrus the Great freed the Jewish people from their Babylonian captivity in 539 BC, Judea became a Persian province for 2 full centuries. During those 200 years of living side by side, Jewish thinkers absorbed the Zoroastrian vision of linear time, of final judgment, of the cosmic war between light and darkness. Those ideas then flowed directly into Christianity, and from Christianity into Islam. The calendar on your phone right now. The feeling that history is moving towards something. The belief that your choices in this life carry weight beyond this life. All of it, every last piece of it, traces back to a prophet standing alone in the mountains of ancient Iran thousands of years before Christ was born. And yet somehow Iran does not get credited for this in the average history class. Somehow this extraordinary gift to human civilization gets glossed over in 2 sentences while Greece gets entire semesters. That is not history. That is selective storytelling. And we are done with it. Half the world under one crown. In 550 BC, a man named Cyrus, born of a Persian father and a Median mother, did what no one before him had ever managed to do. He united the 2 great peoples of the plateau, raised an army, and in a campaign of stunning speed and brilliance, built what historians now call the Achaemenid Empire, the first true superpower in human history. But here is the thing about Cyrus that really gets me. He conquered half the known world and somehow managed to do it while being genuinely, remarkably nice about it. Like, this man was building a massive empire, and his whole strategy was basically just respect people and they will love you. Which is insane because that is not how any other conqueror in history operated. Every other empire of this era worked on the same brutal logic. You conquer a people, you humiliate them, you burn their temples, you erase their identity. Cyrus walked into Babylon and paid his respects at their temple. He told every conquered people they could keep their religion, their language, their customs. He sent the Jews home to Jerusalem and paid to rebuild their temple with Persian gold. The man was building a multicultural empire 2,500 years before that phrase was even invented. And then the Greeks came along and wrote the history. And suddenly, Cyrus the Great, the man who issued what is literally one of the first human rights declarations in recorded history, became a footnote. While Greek generals who burned cities and enslaved populations got monuments and holidays and movies made about them. We need to talk about this. We really do. His successor, Cyrus the Great, expanded this empire to a scale that is genuinely difficult to mentally visualize. From the shores of Greece in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, from Central Asia in the north to Egypt in the south, nearly 50 million people, half the entire human population of the earth at that time, lived under Persian rule. Darius built roads that stretched thousands of miles. He created a royal postal system so fast that messages could cross the empire in days. He minted gold coins and built a unified tax system. He was essentially running a proto-modern state while the rest of the world was still trying to figure out basic governance. And then there are the Greeks, celebrating themselves for holding off the Persians at Thermopylae. 300 Spartans, the movie, the legend. Look, the Greeks fought bravely, absolutely. But can we be honest for a moment? For the Persian Empire, losing a handful of Greek city-states was the geopolitical equivalent of losing a parking space. The empire still controlled half the world. It barely noticed. And what did the Persians do next? They just started funding Athens against Sparta and Sparta against Athens until the Greeks were so exhausted fighting each other that in 387 BC, they signed a peace treaty entirely on Persian terms. Persia did not conquer Greece with an army. It bought Greek submission with Persian gold. And the Greeks still think they won. Alexander and the revenge of culture. The real blow came later, and I want you to feel the weight of this moment because it matters. In 330 BC, a young Macedonian king named Alexander, ambitious, brilliant, and absolutely ruthless, crushed the Persian army and burned Persepolis to the ground. Persepolis, one of the most magnificent cities human beings had ever constructed. Burned. Gone. Alexander stood there and watched it burn, and history recorded it as a great victory. 1,000 years of civilization reduced to ash and rubble in a single night. It seemed to the watching world that Iran was finished. The Greeks were in charge now. Their culture, their language, their art was supposed to wash over the Iranian plateau like a tide that would leave nothing recognizably Iranian behind. The Seleucid Empire, ruled by one of Alexander's generals, replaced the Persian dynasty. Greek was the language of power. Hellenization was the policy. Iran was supposed to become Greek. And then, and this genuinely makes me laugh every time I think about it, Alexander himself started wearing Persian robes. The conqueror, the destroyer of Persepolis, the man who burned the greatest city in the world, started dressing like a Persian king, adopted Persian court ceremonies, demanded that his Macedonian generals bow before him in the Persian fashion. His generals were absolutely furious. They mutinied, they complained. And Alexander could not stop himself because Persian civilization is not a collection of customs you can just ignore. It is a gravitational field. Get close enough and it pulls you in whether you want it to or not. Within a century, the Seleucid Greeks were gone, replaced by the Parthians, an Iranian people who declared themselves heirs to the Persian legacy and fought Rome itself to a standstill for 5 centuries. And then the Sassanids arose and built a state so powerful that Rome and later Byzantium spent 400 years trying and failing to defeat it. Iran had done it again, absorbed the conqueror, rewritten the story, refused to disappear. The Arab conquest and the silent resistance. In 651 AD, the Sassanid Empire, already bled white by centuries of war, collapsed before the armies of the Arab Caliphate. The last Persian king was hunted down and murdered. The ancient capital fell. Iran was now under Arab rule, and the new religion of Islam was spreading across the plateau like wildfire. And this is the part that should make your blood boil if you understand what was at stake. The Arab rulers who came after the conquest actively tried to force Iranians to abandon everything they were: their language, their traditions, their ancient identity. Various Umayyad governors treated Iranians as second-class citizens within the very empire their taxes were funding. They tried to make Arabic the only language that mattered. They tried to reduce one of the oldest and most sophisticated cultures on earth to a conquered province that would eventually forget it had ever been anything else. They wanted Iran to become Arab, permanently, completely, the way Egypt became Arab, the way Syria became Arab, the way so many ancient cultures dissolved and never came back. But the Iranians struck back, not with armies, with brains. Iranian scholars, bureaucrats, poets, and administrators quietly made themselves so indispensable to the Islamic Caliphate that the Arab rulers could not function without them. The entire administrative machinery of the empire ran on Persian expertise. Persian methods of governance flowed into the heart of the Islamic world and transformed it. And the Persian language, Farsi, did not die. It absorbed Arabic vocabulary and came back stronger than before, becoming the language of poetry and science and philosophy across the entire Eastern Islamic world from Central Asia to India. So let me get this straight. The Arabs conquered Iran, tried to replace its language and culture, and ended up with their caliphate running on Iranian bureaucrats, their literature written in Farsi, and their rulers adopting Persian court customs. Iran lost the war and won everything else. Again. At this point, it is almost funny. Almost. The Mongol storm. If the Arab conquest was a catastrophe, then what arrived from the east in 1220 was something that goes beyond any word I can find to describe it. Genghis Khan and the Mongol armies did not simply conquer Iran. They tried to erase it from the surface of the earth. Cities that had stood for 1,000 years were annihilated in days. Entire populations were massacred. Men, women, children, scholars, poets, farmers, everyone. Ancient irrigation systems that had sustained life on the Iranian plateau for thousands of years were deliberately destroyed. Rivers ran black with the ink of burned libraries. This was not war. This was annihilation. And the people responsible for it are still sometimes romanticized in popular culture as adventurous nomads, which is honestly one of the most obscene historical whitewashings I can think of. It seemed impossible, genuinely, rationally impossible, that anything Iranian could survive what the Mongols did.
And yet, when Genghis Khan's grandson Hulagu established a Mongol state on Iranian territory, the most extraordinary reversal in this entire extraordinary story began to unfold. These ferocious destroyers began to build. They converted to Islam. They made Farsi the official language of their court. They commissioned Persian mosques with soaring blue domes. They funded Iranian scholars and poets. Within 2 generations, the grandchildren of men who had massacred Iranian cities were writing Persian poetry and debating Islamic philosophy. Tamerlane came at the end of the 14th century and did it all over again. Slaughtered, built pyramids from human skulls, which is genuinely one of the most horrifying things any human being has ever done, and I want to be very clear that this is not funny. But what happened next kind of is. Because Tamerlane, the man who built towers from the skulls of his victims, stood in front of Iranian artists and went completely silent in awe. He was so overwhelmed by Persian culture that he packed up the best Iranian artisans and took them back to his capital to make his own city beautiful. His descendants then sparked one of the greatest Persian cultural renaissances in history. The man came to destroy, and his grandchildren ended up being the biggest fans of Persian art in the world. Iran did not just survive Tamerlane. Iran turned Tamerlane's dynasty into its own cultural project. The Safavids and the Shia identity. From 3 centuries of Mongol and Turkic chaos, a man named Shah Ismail emerged in 1501 and did something that would permanently reshape the map of religion and politics in the entire Islamic world. He united Iran under the Safavid dynasty and declared Shia Islam, previously a minority tradition, the official state religion of Iran. This was Iran doing what Iran always does, refusing to be absorbed, insisting on a distinct identity that no outside power could replicate or replace. By choosing Shia Islam, Iran drew a permanent line between itself and the great Sunni Ottoman Empire to its west, between itself and the Sunni powers to its east, between itself and any future attempt to simply fold Iranian identity into a larger Islamic whole. It was a 5,000-year-old civilization saying, "We are still here. We are still ourselves, and we will remain ourselves." The Safavid period that followed produced some of the most heartbreakingly beautiful art and architecture human beings have ever created. The city of Isfahan that Shah Abbas the Great rebuilt in the early 17th century was described by European travelers as the most magnificent city on earth. Standing in its great central square, surrounded by soaring mosques tiled in turquoise and gold, you can feel 5,000 years of civilization pouring out of every stone. This is what Iran looks like when it is left alone to be itself. This is what it built when the storms finally paused. The modern struggle, anger. By the 19th century, Iran was once again facing something that makes me furious to describe. 2 of the great European colonial empires, Britain and Russia, had decided between themselves that Iran was not really a country. It was a prize, a territory to be divided and exploited. Russia took the north. Britain pumped the oil from the south. When Iranians protested, they were ignored or suppressed. The ancient civilization that had absorbed every conqueror for 5,000 years now found itself being treated as a resource rather than a nation, as a backdrop for European geopolitical games rather than as a people with their own history, their own dignity, their own rights. The response came in 1925, when Reza Shah Pahlavi came to power and began a radical modernization program. But it was a single act in 1935 that sent a message to the entire world. For centuries, the Western world had called this country Persia, a name the Greeks had invented from a single regional name and imposed on the whole civilization. Reza Shah sent a formal directive to every embassy on earth. From this day forward, the country would be called by its own ancient name, the name its people had always used for themselves: Iran. 2 syllables. That is all it was. 2 syllables sent to the embassies of the world in a formal diplomatic note. But inside those 2 syllables was the entire 5,000-year answer to every empire that had ever tried to rename this civilization, rewrite this civilization, replace this civilization. We are not your Persia. We are not your exotic fantasy. We are not your colonial possession. We are Iran. We have always been Iran. And you will call us by our own name, or you will not call us at all. The code that cannot be broken. Today, 2 words live side by side in the global imagination. Persia, ancient, romantic, golden, associated with poetry and carpets and fairy tales and lost grandeur. And Iran, modern, contested, complex, caught in the crossfire of sanctions and geopolitics, and headlines that reduce 5,000 years of civilization to a series of crises and conflicts. And that is perhaps the final injustice in this entire story. That the same civilization which gave the world its first human rights declaration, its first international peace treaty, its concept of linear time, its model of multicultural governance, is today reduced in the Western media to a geopolitical problem. That the country of Rumi and Hafez and Cyrus and Darius, the country whose poets are still quoted in 100 languages, whose architecture still makes people weep with its beauty, is discussed almost entirely in terms of nuclear programs and sanctions.
History deserves better than this. Iran deserves better than this. And frankly, so do we. Because we cannot understand the world we live in if we refuse to understand where it came from. But here is what I want you to take away from this story. This civilization has been conquered more times than almost any other on Earth. It has lost armies and capitals and kings. It has watched its greatest cities burn. It has endured plague and massacre and colonial humiliation and sanctions. And every single time, it has come back. Not just survived, come back, rebuilt, created, produced art and poetry and philosophy and architecture that takes your breath away. History has a word for what Iran has done across 5,000 years. It is not survival. Survival is passive, just waiting for the storm to pass. What Iran has done is something far more active, far more intentional, and far more extraordinary than mere survival. It has transformed every storm into rain that watered its own garden. It has turned every conqueror into a student. It has made every attempt at erasure into fuel for renewal. The code of this civilization has not been broken in 5,000 years. And something tells us it will not be broken now. Follow Code of Echoes, because history is not just the past. It is the hidden code inside everything around you right now. And we are just getting started.